From the KSL Broadcast House, this is Sunday Edition with Doug Wright.
And good morning, everybody. Welcome to the program. We're really glad to be back with you in the new year. It's been a rocky start to the new year for the United States Congress, the new Congress in Washington, D.C. Their first week consisted of days of real disorder and dysfunction among House Republicans who are divided over who should be their speaker. Republican leader Kevin McCarthy has been making concessions and negotiating with the right-wing holdouts that are blocking his election. McCarthy suffered more than a dozen defeats. At last count, I believe it was 13 in his race for the House Speaker, making this the longest Speaker contest in 164 years. A nominee needs 218 votes, and that number could change if members withhold their votes. And the House cannot get to work until the Speaker is elected. I want to remind everybody that we have recorded this segment with Congressman Stewart on Friday afternoon, so that count of 13 is valid as we have this conversation, and I believe the next vote might happen later on tonight around 10 o'clock Eastern Time. And Congressman Chris Stewart, welcome to Sunday Edition. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's always an honor to be with you, Doug. Thank you.
What kind of footing does this put? Let's assume for a moment that Kevin McCarthy will get the ranks and file together and that we will get to the point where he becomes the next speaker. He's been speaker before. So, but what kind of footing does that put him on in this new Congress?
Yeah, well, I think Kevin is going to be an extraordinary speaker, and I really mean that. And there's a lot of reasons why. But being the Speaker of the House, a Republican Speaker of the House is an impossible job. It's the hardest job in the world. We saw that with John Boehner. We saw it with Paul Ryan, and I think we're about to see it with Kevin McCarthy. It's extraordinarily more difficult if you have a 4-seat majority instead of a 20-seat majority, and Kevin is seeing that this week. But I got to tell you, too, Doug, I think this may actually work to our benefit for two primary reasons. Number one is I think it exhausts some of the energy, some of the emotion, and some of the opposition to Kevin and to moving forward now, so that when we get to the very difficult votes, and it's going to be easy for us to unite on, border security, on some of the legislation we're going to do to drive down the price of energy or drive down inflation, or some of the legislation we'll do with what we teach our kids in public schools. And the list goes on and on. But eventually, in probably June or July, we're going to get to some of those harder votes, which are how do we raise the debt ceiling limit? How do we pass appropriation bills? And those are always very difficult. Again, I think some good news is that I think there'll be some people who will be far less likely to challenge that process and to vote to vacate the chair and put us back in this position than they would have been if we wouldn't have gone through this. So as messy as it's been, as frustrating as it's been for many of us, including the American people as they've watched it, my hope is, and I don't think I'm being Pollyannish, I think this is actually likely, is that we're far less likely to do that again in the summer when it comes to passing some difficult legislation.
As I was introducing the topic, I may have misspoken. Would you remind us, I know the leadership position for Kevin McCarthy, he's been very prominent in leadership. Has he ever actually been the Speaker of the House?
He hasn't. He was the leader under Paul Ryan. He ran for Speaker. You may remember Jason Chaffetz, a good friend of ours, was potentially going to run against him. But anyway, he didn't run and did not win the speakership. He was always the leader.
When the behind-the-scenes negotiations are going forward, and you do have a real substantial number of Republicans who are voting for you, but there are enough holdouts to cause vote after vote after vote after vote after vote, all the way now, as I mentioned, at the recording of this interview, 13 votes. What kind of negotiations have to go on? What are these folks holding out for, and what kind of concessions, in your opinion, have been made?
Well, two things I'd say on that, Doug. One is I would remind you and your viewers, and I think most of you know this, but just to remind you, this isn't the first time we voted for our leader. After the general election in November, Republicans and Democrats both come back to Washington, D.C., and those who are elected vote for their leadership. We had a vote to have Kevin be the new Speaker of the House. Anyone could run. there was a campaign, there were campaign speeches, and then we voted, and Kevin won that election. And it wasn't even close. It was 190 to 30 or something like that. And so at that point, he becomes the Speaker of the House, or the Speaker of the House elect. And yet they've taken advantage of this formal process we go through. And look, some of these guys are friends of mine, and I agree with some of the things they wanted. Some of the rule changes were things that all of us supported, and actually they're good for Congress and better for the economy and for our own country. But then it got to the point in the last few days where some of them, not many, Doug, but maybe 2 or 3 of them were now holding out for things of their own benefit, to be put on select committees or to be given, maybe a subcommittee chairmanship. But when they start asking for things to their own, for their own good or for their own benefit, that's where the anger among us really gets to a boil. If they're arguing over principle, all of us will give them that, and we'll try to listen and to support that. But a few have argued for something that was for their own good, and that became difficult. Now, your question was what kind of negotiations? I mean, they're ongoing and they're very, very personal. They're one-on-one. It's not just Kevin. In fact, Kevin has not been negotiating with them over the last few days. It's been members. It's been people like myself and others who go to some of them who are friends and ask them and say, well, what do you want? What could we do to help you? What are your objections? And it's been, I think, a concerted effort with many, many members of Congress who've been involved with that.
For some of the members that maybe continue on here, even to the point where Kevin McCarthy does indeed become the Speaker, but yet they're still outspoken about him not being the Speaker, will there be payback? Will they be left out in the cold?
Yeah, that's always a temptation. That's kind of our human nature. And honestly, there's an argument to be made that is, if there's no repercussions, if there's no punishment, then that's bad policy, and it incentivizes this kind of disruptive behavior where you're not playing part of the team and you're ignoring an election that we already had. But, Doug, it's just not a good idea. I mean, we just shouldn't be I don't think in this environment, we shouldn't be, retribution or punishment for others. We had a disagreement. We'll work it out. There's frustration while we do work it out. But once we've elected Kevin as our Speaker, I think almost all of us feel like, okay, put that behind us. Now let's move forward. We don't want to start another contentious conversation about, well, how are we going to punish him? Let's just move forward and try to do the work that we all feel is so important.
Chris, I'm interested, let's go ahead and assume, which seems to be very likely, that the next Speaker of the House will be Kevin McCarthy. What are the things you're looking forward to initially? What do you think will happen first that the American people, Republicans and Democrats, will actually perk up and go, wow, that's great that finally happened?
Yeah, there's a number of things. I mean, one of the very first things that we want to do is pass funding legislation that makes it impossible to hire an additional 87,000 IRS agents. Maybe we should hire additional IRS agents. We don't know. But it's interesting to know, a lot of people don't realize this, there's only 70,000 IRS agents now. We're more than doubling the size of the agency. Before we do that, we should have a real debate and a real conversation of, is that necessary? And why are we spending that much money? And what do we hope to accomplish? They say that they're going after the billionaires. No, they're not. There's not enough billionaires and millionaires in the country for 87,000 additional IRS agents to go after. They're going to go after small business. And unfortunately, we've had too many examples of the IRS using political bias in some cases, targeting people. And we want to be really careful that doesn't happen. So that's one example of where we'll get started. But Doug, there's so much more. As I said, reducing the cost of energy, opening up Western lands, including in Utah, to take advantage of our natural resources like we were just a few years ago. Really addressing the debt. It's one of the primary concerns that we're going to focus on in the next 2 years. We have to reduce government spending. We have to reduce our debt, or we're headed towards an economic catastrophe. The list is long, and I think you'll see a pretty aggressive amount of activity in the first 3 or 4 months.
Chris, I look forward to future conversations, and thank you so much for joining us today here on Sunday Edition. We'll take a brief break, and we'll come right back with more of the show. Stay with us. Concerns are growing, and boy, this has been an ongoing conversation here on Sunday Edition over the shrinking of the Great Salt Lake. Last week, researchers have called on lawmakers to take bold action to save the Great Salt Lake from its ongoing collapse. They say if there's not a dramatic increase in water flow to the lake this year and next, its disappearance could cause immense damage to Utah's public health, environment, the economy, and the lead author of this emergency briefing is here with us on Sunday Edition, Ben Abbott from Brigham Young University. And Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Doug.
I was telling you when I was a kid, the Great Salt Lake was a big deal, but it wasn't quite the tourist attraction that it used to be when we had Salt Air and all of the dances and everything out there long before even my time. But boy, the focus on the Great Salt Lake just seemed to go down. But now, everybody's talking about how important it is. And I appreciated in the executive summary of your findings, you've called it the keystone to our ecosystem.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
You know, we live in the Great Basin, which isn't quite a desert technically, but it's really close. And so these aquatic ecosystems are crucial pieces of habitat. Sometimes we think about an ecosystem as lots of different parts, but I think of it as an ecologist as a living thing. And so the Great Salt Lake is this crucial island of water in the vast sea of the Great Basin. And if we're not wise stewards of this ecosystem, there could be, as you mentioned, really serious consequences, not only for the tens of millions of birds that depend on it, but for our community as a whole.
Well, you think of the wetlands and you think of all of that.
Yeah.
My friend Terry Tempest Williams has written about that often.
Yeah.
Just what a treasure that is. But I also remember when they told us all years ago when I was a young man that, well, you know, the Great Salt Lake is just kind of going away, and then they built the freeways and everything, and all the old timers said, you're building too close to the lake. Yeah. And people just laughed like, yeah, okay, welcome to the past.
Yeah.
Sure enough, they were too close to the lake.
Yeah.
Union Pacific Railroad, UDOT, all of the freeway system had to be elevated, moved, everything else. So are we in a natural or an unnatural cycle?
You know, that's a great question. These salty lake or saline lake ecosystems naturally go up and down. You know, there's no outlet to the ocean. So a freshwater lake, it only gets to a certain level and then it spills out through the river to the ocean. But these lakes are very sensitive to changes in weather. And if you look back over the past 150 years where we have good records, there have been natural ups and downs, but what we're seeing now is an unnatural phenomenon that's being driven by overuse of water in the watershed.
I was going to ask about that. Is it overuse, lack of conservation? What about climate change? Is that a factor?
Yes, absolutely. Climate change is what we call a threat multiplier. You know, so we've always had a certain water budget that was a sustainable amount that we could use while the ecosystem stays healthy. Climate change has reduced that budget. And so we're in a situation now where we have to decide, are we going to live within our means and bring our water demand down into a range that the ecosystem can supply, or are we going to pretend like everything's the same as it's always been and move forward?
In my lifetime, I have seen this. My grandfather used to have a cabin. They used to call it in Big Cottonwood, but it was actually down by Tuscany and the Cotton Bottom in that area of Knudsen Corner. But the water always flowed.
Yeah.
Now, Big Cottonwood Creek is dry for a huge portion of the year. I noticed with Mill Creek and other things, Little Cottonwood Creek, Red Butte, you name it, the flows are down. Do those smaller streams, how big a factor is that compared to the Jordan River and the Bear?
So the three main tributaries are the Bear River, the Jordan River, and the Weber River. But all of those depend on the small tributaries that flow into them. So these smaller streams, like the one that you mentioned, they're a bellwether, an indicator of what's going on in the ecosystem. And until about 10 years ago, those small streams were still flowing pretty well, like they had been. But we've seen, especially since the year 2000, a decline in the amount of available water. And the thing that inspired us to write this report was, if you look at the flow data to the lake since the year 2020, we have lost an amazing amount of water. Many of us expected the decline of the lake to slow down. It has less surface area, and as the water gets saltier, there's less evaporation that takes place. But instead, we really saw the lake drop off a cliff. We've lost about 1.2 million acre-feet each year since 2020.
In the remaining minute or two that we have, what can we do? And because the option of having that lake go dry is just unthinkable.
Yeah.
With the dust and the winds and the arsenic and the lead and everything else that's there. And other states have dealt with this where they have allowed a saline lake to go dry. And it's not a good idea.
Yeah.
So what are we doing? Are we on the right path? What is the legislature going to do? And I think you called on the governor to basically declare a watershed-wide emergency rescue.
Yeah. So there's been fabulous progress. Laws have been passed, especially in the last legislative session, that are putting in place long-term measures for conservation to bring our, about 80% of the water use is agricultural. And thankfully, farmers are really engaged on this issue. They care about our community, they care about Great Salt Lake, they want to conserve. So those things long-term are being put in place. We think that the added measures that we need are a short-term emergency water release. The lake has really gotten to a tipping point, a threshold, where if we don't take action, then the salinity levels are going to get to a point that they knock out the lake's food webs. And that's a really serious consequence. So this year and next, we're calling on everyone, led by the governor's office, to really reduce water use. Based on our calculations, we need to decrease total water use by 30 to 50% over the next few years so that the lake can begin a recovery.
You know, when you talk about the industries out there, it's not just the extraction industries, it's the brine shrimp. Yep. Seriously, that is a big deal. And I wonder how many Utahns really know that. I look forward to future conversations with you on this. I think as we look at this amazing treasure that we have here, that our state is so well known for. I mean, people from all over the world have asked me about the Great Salt Lake, and we tend to take it for granted, and I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Doug.
For people who want to get more information, where should they go?
The full report's accessible at gsl.byu.edu. So that's Great Salt Lake, gsl.byu.edu.
Let's end on a really positive note, at least right now.
Yeah.
How are we doing this winter?
It is such a blessing.
There's a smile.
We're at about 170% of the normal snowpack. This gives us an opportunity to make sure that infusion of fresh water makes it to the lake, and it gives us time to respond.
Thank you so much. We'll be right back with more on Sunday Edition, so stay with us. This month, lawmakers will have the final vote on the new design for the new Utah state flag. It was a long process to get to this point. It took almost 2 years and thousands of designs and a lot of public input. Back in November, Utah's State Flag Task Force made a final selection for the new Utah state flag, and now the lawmakers are going to vote on it. And Senator Dan McKay is here with us. Senator, we thank you for joining us over the years. And boy, you have brought the actual article. Should we just hold this up a little bit, maybe? So this is the proposed new Utah state flag. And maybe while we're holding it up, you could talk about some of the significance and how we ended up with this design.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things we started out with. One, we started out with an open mind of what could we have? And we narrowed it down, and when we got a lot of public input, what was very clear, everyone wanted to see the beehive front and center.
Right, and boy, we've got that front and center.
And it's 276% more beehive.
Yeah.
How's that?
There we go.
So, and then, you know, then when we tried to figure out what the background might look like to support the beehive, grabbing familiar elements of our landscape with our dark skies at the top, our gorgeous snow-covered mountains, and then our red rocks down in the south with our little shout out to the valley of some of our beautiful red valleys. It is, I mean, this thing has been a work of art, and obviously we have the hexagon. A lot of people ask me, Doug, why the hexagon?
Yeah.
Because the old flag has a circle and those things. But as we were digging through it, the only thing in a beehive that the bees make themselves is the hexagon.
The hexagon.
In their cell. It's in everyone. It's naturally occurring, and it is the strongest naturally occurring architectural shape in the world. And so the idea of taking the hexagon from inside the hive and bringing it out, it is the strength, and that's really that symbolism of strength. I really believe that Utah is the strength of the nation.
I have to tell you, I like this design. I really do. And yeah, I remember back in the Pioneer Jubilee when they had the big celebration in '97, and the significance, the different colors that were in the flag. There was the sage green, and there was the Indian paintbrush red, and then the golden color of the grain. And I love things that are symbolism, but not just beating it down your throat. And this really seems to capture that and to have you describe that for us. But tell us about the star below the beehive.
Star is a Native American symbol for hope. And we have a current, on our current flag, we have an important call out for our Native American tribes, and we wanted to make sure we included them in our reapplication of the flag. And it's a great emblem of hope.
Well, and everything here that you've talked about has impacted the Native American tribes, the pioneers, us today, and for the people in the future. The Red Rock, the valleys, the dark, beautiful blue skies, and everything else. Plus, there's a patriotic thing, red, white, and blue, which is good in there as well. So in the moment or two that we have left, what has to happen now? And the legislature, they do have the final decision and the governor's signature.
Yeah. So that's just it, right? Whether it's a great design or a bad design, I was just reading about the history last night about how we adopted our current flag. We came up with it in 1903. It was adopted in 1911, and it took that long for the legislature to really buy onto a state flag. And now here we're going to replay that from the early 1900s, and we're going to do it again. We've got to get the support of the Senate, the House, and I know where the governor is, and I'm confident that if we deliver this to his desk, he's signing it. This has a collaborative effort that has had so many people involved, and to think about the big weighty issues that we're going to deal with this session, dealing with taxes, dealing with balancing the state budget, dealing with the record money in education, for us to have just a small peripheral project of working on this state flag for the last year has been phenomenal. It's been a great experience.
Senator McKay, thank you for joining us. And is it a vexillologist?
A vexillologist.
Yeah, who once told me that your state flag ought to be a flag that the kids have a reasonable shot at drawing. And this one meets it. Dan, thanks so much.
Thank you.
For joining us here on Sunday Edition. And thank you for being part of the program. We hope you'll join us again next week. And music and the spoken word is coming your way next.